An informatory vindication of a poor, wasted, misrepresented remnant of the suffering anti-popish, anti-prelatic, anti-Erastian, anti-sectarian, true Presbyterian Church of Christ in Scotland, united together in a general correspondence, by way of reply to various accusations in letters, informations, and conferences given forth against them. A vindication of the United Societies of some Presbyterians in Scotland who contend against the defections of the time. The introduction, containing a brief deduction of the series and tract of some signal steps of our Church's defection which, from time to time, some have witnessed against. None that ever heard of the Church of Scotland can be altogether ignorant how, when the Lord was graciously pleased to confer upon this land the inestimable benefit of the pure and clear shining light of the gospel, and to advance the Reformation therein begun to a very high degree from mere heathenism, even to the extirpation of popery, prelacy, and Erastianism, which our Church hath had chiefly to wrestle against, and the abjuration of all heretical and sectarian errors, whether in doctrine, worship, discipline, or government, that then all ranks of the land were brought into holy and solemn covenants with God, the Church did enjoy her power and privileges, then when our ministers were clothed with righteousness and salvation, their faithfulness to God and zeal against sin, and all lukewarmness in the Lord's cause, were so much seen and shown, that ministers, for their not applying their doctrine against the corruptions of the times, were to be censured, and if obstinate, were to be deposed, according to that act of the General Assembly, August 3rd, 1648, Session 26. And likewise compliers with the public enemies of his church, and kingdom, were according to the degree of their offense to be rebuked and censured by that act of the General Assembly, June 17th, 1646, Session 14. In those days the work of the Lord prospered, his gospel flourished, and iniquity was made to stop her mouth. Our Church was glorious to all beholders, and terrible to her enemies, as an army with banners. The Lord delighted in us, and our land was married unto him. Salvation was written upon our walls, and praise upon our gates. But alas, we did quickly turn away from following the Lord, forgetting what great and eminent privileges he had bestowed upon us, how he had subdued our enemies under us, and made them to yield, and prospered us in what we put our hands unto. We did, alas, soon fall from our first love. The edge of our zeal became blunted, and our eyes were darkened that we could not see. And so we have gone further astray from one degree to another, until we have brought ourselves into such a misery of dissolution and desolation, division and confusion, reproach and contempt, that our case now is as deplorable and despicable as ever it was formerly admired and envied. Wherefore, to make it the more clearly appear, whence it is that now our manifold breaches are so wide, alienation of spirits so heightened, various and contrary information so flying abroad, and we redacted to such a paucity, we shall here premise a brief deduction in cumulo of the series and tract of some signal steps of our Church's defection, showing also, notwithstanding therefore, how the Lord hath continued and conveyed down the testimony to the Reformation, although to us it is matter of grief and sorrow to discover our mother's nakedness, which is also our own shame. But the clearing of the testimony and the vindication of truth doth necessitate us thereunto. While our Church was enjoying her privileges and was terrible to her adversaries, a great part both of the Church and State fell upon public resolutions, whereby no malignants, and men disaffected to the work and people of God, were admitted to places of power and trust, both in judicatories and armies, which, notwithstanding, was faithfully protested and contended against by several ministers and professors of all ranks at that time, as also the toleration of sectaries in Cromwell's time, and even his usurpation was witnessed against by some. But as it was our sin, first and last, to meddle with Charles II, while he gave all along such clear evidences of his being an enemy to the cause of God, so we found the bitter effects of it, in that, when he was restored again, he did quickly forget all his oaths and vows to the Most High, wherein he had been, as some did clearly see by many discoveries, a mocking and dissembling hypocrite, and did at one blow cut off the neck of our noble constitution of Church and State, and reintroduced abjured prelacy, which many ministers did embrace, while others left their charges at his command, even without so much as a joint and formal protestation, entered against that heaven-daring act of tyranny, except that some were found witnessing against it in their singular capacities for themselves, And when congregations were so destitute of faithful pastors, the most part, both of ministers and professors, did countenance prelacy, in hearing of hireling intruders. Yea, as if no testimony had been required in this point, very few continued preaching the gospel as they had opportunity. Howbeit, as the Lord always had, and will have, some witnesses against such heinous indignities, so he did stir up a company both of ministers and professors who did appear at Pentland, anon 1666, quote, and there did bear testimony to the covenanted work of Reformation, to the shedding of their blood, both in fields and scaffolds, unquote. But were concurred with and countenanced by a few, in respect to those who were obliged. Also, after that breach was made upon the Lord's camps, the most part of ministers became sinfully silent, forbearing to encourage, warn, and teach people by the preached gospel. But some, notwithstanding of the then ominous and badly presaging face of affairs, setting the trumpet to their mouth, ventured to give a certain sound, and to go forth hero-like, to display the banner of Christ's blessed gospel, who for their so doing were censured by their brethren in a meeting at Edinburgh. Then enemies, seeing that by their cruelty they could not prevail, as at the overturning of the work of Reformation, they had brought upon the stage that mother of a Christ-degrading and dethroning supremacy, and by a law established it upon the usurper, which also passed without a joint in public testimony. So they began now to exert that usurped power, and to work by ensnaring and destroying policy, and knowing that nothing would more fortify it than ministers homologating and acknowledging it. Therefore they offered that first indulgence, a court-contrived license, bound with so many restrictions and instructions, flowing forth from that idol of jealousy, the aforesaid supremacy. Of set purpose to divide Zion's builders according to the Machiavellian principle, divide and impera, divide and then command, which many embraced, like the silly Trojans beguiled by another deceitful Sinon, to bring the wooden horse through their own walls, already broken down with their own hands to their own destruction. Many others gaped after it, who could not enjoy it, and many pleaded for the countenancing of it when embraced. And as it had few who opposed it at first, so these that afterwards contended against it as a defection, how were they suspected, reproached, and contradicted? And some of them in sundry presbyteries censured and rebuked, as namely Mr. Cameron at Sundowall, in the parish of Dunscore, in Nithsdale, and in Edinburgh, and others elsewhere. Yet notwithstanding of the lukewarmness and indifferency of many, the Lord stirred up a handful to publish the testimony at Rutherglen, May 29th, 1679, bearing witness against the sacrilegious supremacy, the declaration condemning our covenants, the act for keeping the 29th of May as an holy anniversary day of thanksgiving for the upsetting of the tyrant, and against other nefarious acts of Parliament, and all prejudices done to the interest of Christ in the land. And for confirmation of their testimony they did burn the foresaid acts, according as the adversary had burnt our holy covenants, and did extinguish the bonfires upon the same anniversary day. Nevertheless, when the Lord's people did appear at Bothwell the same year, to recover the church's due privileges, the people's liberties, many ministers and professors did plead for taking in the tyrant's interest into the declaration of that army, thereby misstating the quarrel of the offense of many, to the offense of many, and opposed the inserting of the indulgence among the steps of our defection. Likewise, the Lord making us then to fall before our enemies for our sins, and because we refused to return, several ministers accepted of the adversary's indemnity in terms that inferred a condemning of themselves, though no transgression was committed. And when the triumphing enemies were erecting trophies of victory after Bothwell defeat, setting up the heads of the renowned martyrs, Mr. Kidd and Mr. King, to witness, not only for religion and liberty, against the destroyers of both, but also against the unfaithfulness of their brethren in the ministry, and insulting over the captives of the Lord's people, and imposing an ensnaring bond of peace, which did imply a plain betraying of the cause and condemning of all that had been done for promoting the work of Reformation. Many ministers were silent, and refused to give their advice, and some were not ashamed to persuade these prisoners to put forth their hand to that iniquity. Many also voted in that so-called assembly for embracing the last indulgence with the cautionary bond, which was no better, if not worse, than the former, at least approved of and consented unto that deed. Yea, many from that time did forbear preaching in the open fields, but kept within houses, or near to houses, in homologation of the tyrant's orders, or at least that the rigor of the law might not be executed against them, while they went so near the borders of obedience. But this did not continue long, for, quote, the enemies soon deprived them of this pretended liberty, unquote. Howbeit the Lord had always some, both of ministers and professors, to bear testimony against these public sins and heinous defections. And even in the midst of this general yielding to the foresaid indulgence, there were sundry ministers, quote, who did not give a formal consent to the embracement of it, unquote. Though it is true, as they were few who dissented therefrom, so they were far fewer who resolutely opposed the same. Yea, when Mr. Richard Cameron came from Holland, before his going to the public work, he went to some ministers, desiring their concurrence with him in keeping up the testimony in the fields, according to the former manner which was followed before Bothwell by many ministers, wherein they were much countenanced of the Lord, but after his waiting some time upon the same, was denied thereof. However, he went forth in great hazard and against much opposition, as a valiant and heroic contender for all the prerogatives of his master, wherein he was signally owned of the Lord, and continued so, until he sealed that noble and necessary testimony with his blood shed in the open fields. Also, how few were not displeased with him, and any else concurring and upholding the standard of the gospel in that faithful manner, so much called for, especially at that time, that it might be a witness and testimony both against the adversaries' encroachings, and also against the shameful and sinful yieldings of the most part of ministers and professors thereunto. Further, when the declaration was published at San Juan, June 22nd of 1680, many of the ministers did condemn it, and few, concurring with the publishers and consenters, did appear publicly for it, even because of its disowning and disclaiming the tyrant's interest. Many accounting such as died upon that head to have laid down their lives upon insufficient grounds, which, notwithstanding, from that time downward the Lord hath honored many martyrs to seal with their blood, greatly countenancing them therein. This testimony did more and more side us, and set us alone. For from thenceforth several, who had not formerly so openly opposed, began to express themselves against that handful and action. However, the testimony being thus stated against the acknowledging of, and complying with the tyranny then raging, and any way strengthening the hands of the persecuting party, it pleased the holy and wise God, for our further trial and his own glory, to deprive us of these worthies who had so stated it, and did so valiantly vindicate it, and at their death did stoutly seal it with their blood, as at Erasmus. Many there being murdered, and others martyred afterwards, particularly Mr. Haxton, who, as he had the honor of being the proto-martyr against tyranny, and of a most positive declining his murderer's pretense upon authority, so had the grace and glory of the Lord's assistance and acceptance in his sufferings, as signal as the barbarous severity of his butchers was every way singular. After which time none of our ministers did concur with us in that part of our testimony, except the famous and faithful Mr. Donald Cargill, which made our case very deplorable, and yet, by the most part, little regarded or pitied for any evidences that we experienced of their sympathy, especially after the death of the never-to-be-forgotten martyr, Mr. Donald Cargill. Sad was the case of the land for some space of time, for now the abominable and damnable errors of John Gibb had been discovered, who, first pretending to outstrip others in a hot and vigorous zeal against all the then current corruptions of the time, did draw some poor well-meaning people, stumbled especially at ministers' defections, into a consortship with himself in his delirious delusions, though not all them alike to the full length of his sorceries and blasphemies. Neither did his followers increase to such a number as was then feared and reported, being within 30, and the most part women.